The morning of August 22nd, 1485, unfolded with a stillness that carried the weight of destiny. Mist hung across the fields of Leicestershire, softening the horizon, blurring the banners that stirred in the breeze. On one side, the emblem of the white boar signaled the presence of King Richard III, the last sovereign of the House of York. On the other, the red dragon fluttered above the smaller host of Henry Tudor, a man who had lived much of his life in exile, yet now stood poised to claim the crown of England. The air was charged with more than the coming clash of arms. It was thick with the hopes of a people weary of endless turmoil. For nearly 30 years, England had been consumed by a conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. It was not a single struggle, but a series of bitter contests between two rival houses, York and Lancaster, each claiming legitimacy to rule. In villages and towns, the common folk had grown accustomed to the sight of noble banners passing by, of armies raising levies, of rulers being made and unmade with startling speed. Crops were planted in uncertainty. Families whispered of shifting allegiances, and the word stability felt more like a dream than a promise. By 1485, when Richard sat upon the throne, the nation was weary to its core. His reign, though marked by boldness, was shadowed by suspicion. Many doubted his right, and whispers of betrayal clung to his name. Into this atmosphere returned Henry Tudor. His claim to the throne rested on a tenuous Lancastrian bloodline, yet in him, supporters saw a chance for renewal. He was young, cautious, and largely untested, having spent years in Brittany and France, far from the chaos of English politics. But his exile had preserved him, keeping him distant from the cycle of defeats that had destroyed so many of his kin. When he landed on English soil in the summer of 1485, he carried not just the hopes of his followers, but the longing of a nation desperate to end the spiral of conflict. On the morning of Bosworth, the two armies faced each other across open ground. Richard commanded a larger force, bolstered by the confidence of his crown. Henry's men were fewer, supported by French contingents and loyalists who had taken a risk in standing by him. Suspense hovered over the loyalties of the Stanleys, a powerful family whose intervention could swing the day. For hours they held back, watching, weighing the course of events. The uncertainty of their decision mirrored the uncertainty of the entire realm. The battle began with the thunder of advancing lines. Dust rose. The cries of soldiers mingled with the clash of steel. Richard, determined to prove his courage, threw himself into the fray. At moments, it seemed the Yorkist king might prevail, his presence pressing against Henry's thinner ranks. But battles often hinge not on numbers but on choices. The Stanleys, at last, declared their support for Henry. Their charge struck with decisive force, fracturing Richard's position and breaking the cohesion of his men. Richard fought fiercely, refusing to retreat, yet his stand came to an end upon that field. With his fall, the tide turned irrevocably. His banner dropped, and the white boar vanished into history. The crown of England, contested for decades, now passed into the hands of the exile. Henry Tudor stood victorious. It was not in Westminster or in a sacred cathedral that Henry received his first crown, but there on the ground of Bosworth. A circlet was placed upon his head, a symbol not only of conquest, but of a kingdom's desperate desire for closure. The image of Henry raised as king amidst the smoke and silence of the battlefield was more than ceremony. It was a declaration that England had reached a turning point. Out of chaos, a new beginning had emerged. The symbolism was profound. By uniting his Lancastrian blood with Elizabeth of York, Henry would soon merge the claims of both houses, weaving together the torn fabric of the nation. From that union would come the Tudor rose, red and white joined, a living emblem of reconciliation. For villagers and nobles alike, it offered a vision of peace long denied. A single victory had ended an age of division and planted the seeds of stability. This was not merely the rise of a new king. It was the start of a dynasty that would shape the very identity of England. Henry VII would govern with caution and calculation, preserving the authority he had fought to win. His son would break with Rome and assert the supremacy of the crown. His granddaughter would preside over a golden age of exploration, culture, and strength. All of it, in one way or another, began in the mist of Bosworth, when fortune smiled upon a man once thought too distant to matter. For those listening today, the story of Bosworth is more than a tale of crowns. It is a reminder that nations can be transformed in a single day, that the choices of a few can alter the destiny of millions, and that from exhaustion and despair can rise renewal. The Tudors would leave a legacy both brilliant and complex, but in 1485, it was only the promise of stability that mattered. Picture the field once more, the banners lowering, the weary silence after the clash, and amid it all, a new sovereign standing where a rival had fallen. That image marked the end of an old age and the birth of a new one. And as this story unfolds further, from Henry's cautious reign to the grandeur of Elizabeth's, the rise of the Tudors will show how a dynasty born on a battlefield could redefine a kingdom and set it upon the path to modernity. And so, Bosworth is remembered not only as the end of civil strife, but as the dawn of a new chapter. The dynasty forged there would carry England from medieval turmoil into the light of a new age. Henry Tudor entered London as Henry VII, with the cheers of a weary people still ringing in his ears. Yet the weight of his crown was heavier than the circle of gold suggested. Victory at Bosworth had made him king, but it had not erased the questions that clung to his lineage. His claim to the throne was slender, traced through the Beaufort line of Lancaster, a branch once declared illegitimate. The crown he wore was gained by conquest, not by the smooth succession of hereditary right. In those first months, every ceremony of state, every council he held, seemed to rest upon trembling ground, as if the throne itself might shift beneath him. The new king understood this better than anyone. He moved cautiously, like a man aware that every shadow might conceal an enemy. Supporters of the fallen House of York remained numerous and powerful, and they watched him with suspicion. His marriage to Elizabeth of York was carefully planned, intended to bind Lancaster and York together. But until that union was sealed, Henry knew he must walk a narrow path. He was king, yes, but in the eyes of many nobles, he was also a usurper whose blood carried little authority. It was not long before these doubts found expression in open challenge. In 1487, scarcely 2 years after Bosworth, a boy named Lambert Simnel was put forward as the true heir of York. He was coached and trained to impersonate Edward, Earl of Warwick, a legitimate Yorkist claimant imprisoned by Henry. Supporters rallied to Simnel's banner, among them discontented nobles and foreign allies willing to test the strength of the new king. For Henry, the threat was alarming, not because a boy might truly be mistaken for royalty, but because it revealed how shallow his roots still were. Discontented factions needed only the shadow of a prince to rally around. Henry's response was swift and careful. He paraded the real Earl of Warwick through the streets of London, showing the people that the boy was a fraud. Yet the danger did not vanish. Simnel's supporters invaded England, clashing with Henry's forces at Stoke Field. Henry prevailed, but the rebellion underscored how fragile his authority remained. The boy himself was spared, given a position in the royal kitchens, an act of mercy that also demonstrated Henry's confidence after victory. Still, the memory lingered. It had taken but one pretender to rally armies against him. Barely had that wound begun to heal when another challenger emerged. Perkin Warbeck appeared in the 1490s, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the vanished princes in the Tower. His story captured imaginations both in England and abroad. European courts received him, recognizing him as a rightful Yorkist prince. To Henry, Warbeck was not just a nuisance, he was a specter that threatened to unravel years of careful consolidation. Unlike Simnel, who had been a puppet in the hands of discontented lords, Warbeck commanded greater credibility. He spoke with conviction, played his role with skill, and won allies from Burgundy to Scotland. For years, Henry faced plots and invasions tied to Warbeck's name. Each one forced him to tighten his grip on the nobility, to reinforce his network of spies, and to shore up his financial resources. The king's treasury became a tool of control, binding lords through bonds and recognizances, ensuring their loyalty was purchased by obligation as much as affection. Henry understood that trust was scarce, and so he fashioned a system where defiance carried costs too heavy to bear. The image of his reign in those early years is not one of triumphal ease, but of constant vigilance. One might imagine the throne of England as a seat surrounded by shifting shadows, each whispering the name of another claimant. In council halls, at court banquets, even in the sanctity of his private chambers, Henry knew that loyalty could turn in a moment. The crown on his head gleamed brightly, yet beneath it, the ground trembled. Still, it was in facing these pretenders that Henry forged the habits that would define his rule: patience, prudence, and relentless caution. Each challenge forced him to look beyond the immediate threat, to weave alliances, to balance severity with clemency, and to construct a monarchy that did not rely solely on bloodline, but on the strength of institutions and the careful management of power. Thus, the opening years of the Tudor dynasty were not a time of peace, but of proving. The boy Simnel and the enigmatic Warbeck tested the new king, as surely as Bosworth had tested the exile. From these trials, Henry emerged not simply as a victor of battles, but as a ruler, learning how to secure a dynasty. And though the throne seemed to tremble under him, each crisis weathered made the foundations firmer until the shadows began, slowly, to recede. The victory at Bosworth had given Henry Tudor the crown, but he understood that steel alone could not secure it. What England needed was not merely a king, but a symbol powerful enough to heal decades of division. That symbol would be found not on the battlefield, but at the altar. In January of 1486, less than half a year after his triumph, Henry married Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of King Edward IV. Their union was more than a matter of affection. It was an act of statecraft as deliberate and transformative as any conquest. Elizabeth carried with her the legacy of the Yorkist line, the house that had worn the crown before Richard's turbulent reign. By taking her as his queen, Henry joined the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York. The emblem that emerged, the Tudor rose, was a living promise of reconciliation. It signified that the two great houses, once locked in a spiral of rivalry, were now entwined in a single bloom. For subjects who had seen fathers and sons divided by allegiance, the image carried a reassurance words could not provide. The marriage was carefully staged to emphasize this unity. In Westminster, nobles gathered to witness the binding of two bloodlines. Chroniclers wrote of the moment with reverence, noting the relief it brought to a weary realm. The symbolism extended beyond the ceremony. Coins were minted bearing the Tudor rose, royal banners carried the new emblem, and church windows depicted the blended flower. Everywhere the message was clear. The wars that had fractured the kingdom had ended, and from their ruins a dynasty arose. Yet beneath the ceremony lay a delicate balance. Henry had been crowned before his marriage, ensuring that his authority derived from conquest and right rather than solely from Elizabeth's claim. It was a subtle but crucial point, for Henry was determined that his kingship should not appear borrowed. Even as he embraced unity, he guarded the independence of his title. Elizabeth, graceful and gentle, accepted this role. She became queen consort not as a rival claimant, but as the figure who made reconciliation visible to all. The effect on the people was profound. Where once households had chosen sides between York and Lancaster, now they could look to the royal family itself as proof of peace. Children born to Henry and Elizabeth embodied the blending of rival houses. Each heir carried within them the blood of both factions, erasing the old lines of division. The kingdom, long torn between competing banners, now looked upon one dynasty, one emblem, one future. For Henry, the marriage strengthened not only his legitimacy but also his strategy of governance. With Yorkist loyalty folded into his household, he could pursue stability with greater confidence. Rebellions would still arise, yet the marriage blunted their force. Pretenders like Perkin Warbeck might claim Yorkist heritage, but their cause was weakened by the visible truth of the Tudor union. To oppose Henry was to oppose not merely Lancaster, but York as well. In the imagination of the realm, the Tudor rose became more than heraldry. It was a story told in gardens, painted in manuscripts, and sung in ballads. A simple flower carried the memory of civil war and the promise of harmony. Like the bloom itself, delicate yet enduring, the Tudor dynasty presented itself as both natural and divinely sanctioned. The image was so potent that centuries later, the rose would remain the defining emblem of Tudor England. The marriage of Henry and Elizabeth thus stood as a turning point in English history. It was not a union born of chance, but of necessity, carefully woven into the fabric of the realm. Out of the rubble of divided loyalties came a dynasty unified in symbol and purpose. The red and the white, once clashing, now blossomed together, declaring that England had been stitched back into wholeness. In this way, Henry VII did more than claim a crown. Through his queen, through the emblem of the rose, he offered his people something greater, the vision of a kingdom reconciled with itself. And in that vision lay the foundations of a monarchy that would endure storms, triumphs, and transformations, yet remain, rooted in the promise first spoken when Lancaster and York became one. Henry VII had survived the test of pretenders and sealed the unity of Lancaster and York through marriage, but survival was not enough. He understood with unyielding clarity that a dynasty must rest on firmer ground than luck or ceremony. If the Tudors were to endure, they required wealth to fund authority, diplomacy to deter rivals, and institutions strong enough to outlast the life of a single king. Henry, cautious by nature, began to craft a kingdom in which the crown would no longer be at the mercy of feuding lords or shifting fortune. The first pillar of his strategy was finance. The treasury he inherited was modest, strained by decades of conflict. Henry approached the crown's resources as both a weapon and a shield. He was frugal in personal expenditure, often noted for his careful record-keeping and his reluctance to indulge in extravagance. Yet this frugality did not weaken his majesty. It fortified it. By conserving royal wealth and ensuring a steady flow of income, Henry reduced his dependence on Parliament and nobles who might otherwise use loans and subsidies as leverage. Central to his financial policy was the practice of bonds and recognizances. These were legal instruments that tied the nobility directly to the crown's interests. A noble suspected of disloyalty could be required to enter into a bond, pledging a substantial sum of money that would be forfeit should he falter. Others signed recognizances, binding themselves and their heirs to good behavior. This system transformed loyalty from a vague sentiment into a tangible obligation. To rebel was not only treason, it was financial ruin. Critics whispered of the king's severity, but Henry saw necessity. In a realm still scarred by civil war, the nobility had to be contained, and through bonds he held them in check. The throne that once trembled on shifting ground began to stand more firmly. Yet Henry knew England could not exist in isolation. Diplomacy was the second pillar of his rule. To secure his dynasty, he turned to the great powers of Europe. In 1489, he arranged the marriage of his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This alliance bound England to the rising Spanish monarchy, strengthening trade and giving the Tudors international legitimacy. When Arthur's untimely death threatened the union, Henry ensured the betrothal passed to his second son, the future Henry VIII, maintaining the Spanish connection. He also looked northward. Relations with Scotland had long been fraught, their borderlands a place of raids and unrest. Henry negotiated the marriage of his daughter Margaret to James IV of Scotland. It was a union that in his lifetime seemed a fragile peace, but in centuries to come, it would bear extraordinary fruit, the eventual unification of the English and Scottish crowns under their descendant James VI and I. In these carefully crafted marriages, Henry extended the reach of the Tudor dynasty beyond the battlefield into the courts and palaces of Europe. The third pillar was the strengthening of central authority. Henry saw clearly the weakness of a monarchy reliant on overmighty subjects. He expanded the use of the royal council, drawing upon men of learning and skill, rather than relying solely on hereditary nobles. Lawyers, administrators, and clerks gained prominence, crafting a machinery of governance that answered directly to the king. The Court of Star Chamber, though controversial, gave the crown a means of disciplining nobles and curbing lawlessness. Slowly, the monarchy was disentangling itself from the medieval web of feudal dependency. Henry's reign was not one of dazzling conquest or flamboyant pageantry. Instead, it was a reign of careful construction. Where others might have sought glory on foreign fields, he sought stability at home. Where others might have trusted in noble bloodlines, he placed his faith in contracts, councils, and coin. His methods were often criticized as cold, even grasping, yet they achieved their purpose. By the time of his death in 1509, he left to his son not a throne precarious and threatened, but a crown enriched, respected, and feared. One can imagine the image of Henry in these years not as a warrior king astride a charger, but as a figure seated at a table, records and ledgers before him, advisors at his side, the machinery of monarchy slowly turning under his watch. His power did not rest upon the clash of arms, but upon the patient binding of wealth, law, and diplomacy into a structure strong enough to endure storms. From bonds that kept lords obedient, to marriages that secured peace with powerful neighbors, to councils that expanded royal oversight, Henry VII forged a monarchy fit for the modern age. His caution may have lacked the romance of conquest, but it was precisely this caution that transformed the fragile victory at Bosworth into the foundation of a dynasty. The Tudors, once a name scarcely known, had become the stewards of England's future, and the house that had begun in uncertainty now stood prepared to shape a kingdom for generations to come. Henry VII did not dazzle his subjects with spectacle, nor did he leave behind tales of romantic heroism. His reign was quieter, steadier, shaped less by the clash of arms and more by the weight of careful decisions. Yet it was precisely this quiet determination that forged the foundations of the Tudor dynasty. Where other kings had gambled with fortune, Henry sought to master it. Where others had grasped at glory, he built for endurance. In the long arc of English history, his legacy was that of a silent architect, designing a monarchy resilient enough to withstand both rebellion and time. By the end of his reign, England was no longer the fractured kingdom he had inherited in 1485. The crown, once fragile, stood secure, his control over the nobility, exercised through bonds, surveillance, and measured rewards, had reduced the danger of overmighty subjects. Though some resented his methods, they recognized their effectiveness. The civil strife that had scarred the land for 3 decades subsided, and the monarchy emerged not as the prize of competing factions, but as the settled center of national life. Henry's rule transformed the very idea of kingship. No longer a title at the mercy of rival claimants, but a structured institution supported by wealth, law, and loyal administration. His legacy extended beyond political order. In diplomacy, he positioned England as a respected player in European affairs, forging alliances through marriage that would echo for centuries. The union of his daughter Margaret with James IV of Scotland would, generations later, unite the crowns of both nations. His arrangement of Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and later its transfer to Prince Henry, linked the Tudors to the great powers of the continent. These choices showed foresight not only for his own reign, but for the dynasty's future. He acted not as a temporary ruler, but as a founder, laying stone upon stone for those who would follow. The wealth he accumulated, sometimes criticized for its severity, gave his heirs the means to rule with confidence. The treasury he left behind allowed his son Henry VIII to begin his reign with unprecedented resources, fueling the ambitious policies and transformations that would mark the next generation. Without Henry VII's thrift, the grandeur of Tudor England might never have been possible. His caution, often seen as cold calculation, was in truth the steady hand that allowed his descendants to dream bolder dreams. Contemporaries and later chroniclers often described Henry as reserved, even somber, a king whose mind was always turning, weighing risks, calculating outcomes. He lacked the charisma of some rulers, but he commanded respect through his discipline. One can picture him in the dim light of his study, parchment and ledgers before him, his expression intent, shaping policy with the patience of a builder rather than the flourish of a conqueror. This image, of a king more architect than warrior, captures the essence of his reign. When he died in 1509, he left a realm more stable than it had been in half a century. The Wars of the Roses, once the defining reality of English politics, were firmly in the past. The Tudor rose, red and white entwined, had taken root as the emblem of unity. His son inherited not the uncertainty of a contested crown, but the authority of a dynasty recognized and respected. In that inheritance lay Henry VII's greatest achievement. He transformed the throne from a prize into a foundation, from a symbol of division into a beacon of continuity. In the grand story of the Tudors, Henry VII is sometimes overshadowed by his flamboyant son and his legendary granddaughter. Yet without him, there would have been no dynasty to remember. He was the cautious builder, the silent architect, the patient founder. From Bosworth's uncertain dawn to the secure twilight of his reign, he proved that power need not roar to endure. His legacy was stability, and on that stability the Tudors built an age that would reshape England forever. When Henry VII passed from the stage in 1509, the crown he had built with such care passed to his second son, Henry. The realm he inherited was secure, wealthy, and ready for a new chapter. Where the old king had been reserved and calculating, his heir was radiant with youth and promise. At 17, Henry VIII stood tall, broad-shouldered, and vigorous, the very image of vitality. Chroniclers spoke of his handsome face, his bright eyes, and the golden aura that seemed to surround him. To a nation weary of caution, the new king appeared as a dazzling dawn. Henry was the embodiment of Renaissance ideals. He excelled in sport, jousting with power, hunting with energy, and mastering the skills of archery and tennis. His court became a place of spectacle where physical prowess was celebrated as much as lineage. Yet his talents were not confined to the field. He was learned, fluent in Latin, conversant with French and Italian, and deeply immersed in theology. He played musical instruments, composed songs, and debated philosophy. The people, who had grown accustomed to the quiet austerity of his father, looked upon their new sovereign with admiration, as if he were the very model of princely perfection. In the early months of his reign, the atmosphere in England shifted perceptibly. Where Henry VII's court had been cautious and restrained, Henry VIII's court glittered with vitality. Feasts were grand, tournaments frequent, and the young king himself often the star of the stage. Nobles and commoners alike delighted in his presence. He carried himself with an ease that made loyalty seem effortless, for he inspired not only respect but affection. The contrast between father and son was stark. The architect had laid the foundation, and now the builder of spectacle would raise a palace upon it. There was, in those days, a sense that fortune itself had turned kindly toward England. Diplomats from abroad marveled at the king's vigor and intellect, reporting back to their courts that England had produced a monarch who seemed destined to rival the great princes of Europe. Henry welcomed this image, surrounding himself with scholars, poets, and athletes, ensuring that his court reflected the brilliance he embodied. It was a time when the young king seemed limitless, his potential unshadowed by the storms that would one day define him. For his subjects, Henry VIII's accession brought a surge of pride. They saw in him not only the heir of Lancaster and York, but the living proof that the careful work of Henry VII had borne fruit. The Tudors were no longer a dynasty scrambling to secure legitimacy. They were the dynasty of England, embodied in a sovereign who shone with almost mythical allure. His very presence seemed to promise that the kingdom would thrive, not merely endure. In this light, one can picture Henry as he appeared in his youth, seated upon the throne in Westminster, clad in rich fabrics, his posture upright, his eyes bright with confidence, a halo of sunlight streaming through high windows to illuminate his figure. It was the portrait of a monarch at the beginning of a reign, surrounded by hope and expectation, the weight of his crown not yet heavy, the burdens of governance not yet dimming his spirit. Thus began the reign of Henry VIII, not with the shadows of suspicion or the tremors of instability, but with the brilliance of youth and the promise of glory. The kingdom, secure at last, rejoiced in a ruler who seemed to embody both strength and refinement, a prince who could ride with knights, speak with scholars, and charm his people in equal measure. The story of Henry VIII would grow darker in years to come, but in those first bright days he was the very symbol of a new age, a young king whose light shone brilliantly upon England. Henry VIII's dazzling beginning soon turned toward a more sober concern, the matter of marriage and succession. For all his brilliance and vigor, the young king knew that the future of the Tudor dynasty depended upon securing an heir, and quickly. England had endured too many years of uncertainty to risk the crown falling once more into dispute. A union had already been arranged long before he took the throne, one carefully designed by his father to anchor England within the web of European power. At its heart was Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand, and Isabella of Spain. Catherine had first come to England as the bride of Prince Arthur, Henry's elder brother. Their marriage, brief and shadowed by Arthur's untimely death, left her a widow in a foreign land. For years her future hung in doubt, but the bond between England and Spain was too valuable to abandon. Thus, when Henry came of age, the path was clear. He would marry Catherine, preserving the alliance his father had so carefully crafted. In June of 1509, only weeks after his coronation, Henry wed Catherine at Greenwich. The marriage was greeted with rejoicing. For the people of England, it symbolized continuity, linking the youthful promise of their new king with the prestige of Spain, the rising power of Europe. For Henry himself, Catherine was more than a diplomatic prize. She was cultivated, devout, and dignified, a woman who had been raised amid the grandeur of the Spanish court and carried with her a regal bearing that complemented his own. Together they appeared the perfect pair, he, the radiant young sovereign, she, the embodiment of continental grace. In those early years, the union was marked by genuine affection. Henry, with his love of display and vitality, found in Catherine a partner who steadied and supported him. She shared his devotions, matched his sense of dignity, and proved a queen admired by the English people. Yet beneath the harmony lay the pressing question that would shape their lives: the need for a male heir. Henry's desire for a son was not simply a matter of pride. Dynastic security depended on it. The Wars of the Roses were still a vivid memory, and the crown Henry wore rested upon the fragile achievements of his father. A daughter might inherit, but in the eyes of many nobles, only a son could guarantee continuity. To Henry, the prospect of a male successor was as essential as the crown itself. Catherine bore children, but tragedy struck repeatedly. Infants died in infancy, leaving the royal couple with grief and uncertainty. Only one child, a daughter named Mary, survived. While her birth was celebrated, it did not quiet Henry's restlessness. He longed for a boy who could ride at his side, joust in the lists, and take up the crown with unchallenged authority. Each year that passed without such an heir deepened his unease. Still, in those early years, hope remained strong. Henry continued to lavish affection upon Catherine, praising her publicly and honoring her position as queen. Foreign ambassadors observed their closeness and reported favorably upon the state of the royal marriage. England's alliance with Spain strengthened, giving the Tudors greater stature among the courts of Europe. To outward eyes, the marriage was a success, its promise unbroken. Yet in the quiet chambers of the palace, the weight of expectation pressed heavily. Every cradle that fell silent reminded the king of the precariousness of his dynasty. He was young, vigorous, and confident, but even he could not ignore the simple truth. The future of his line required a son. And though Catherine remained his queen, beloved and respected, the absence of a male heir would, in time, become the fault line upon which both their lives and the kingdom itself would turn. For now, however, England rejoiced in the union of Henry and Catherine. Together they stood as the image of prosperity, the golden sovereign and his Spanish queen, a couple whose marriage promised stability at home and honor abroad. The young king's story was still one of brilliance, his reign still a canvas painted in bright colors. The shadow of succession had begun to form, but it had not yet overtaken the light of promise. As the years of Henry's reign advanced, the radiant promise of his youth began to be clouded by the single question that had haunted him from the start: succession. Despite Catherine of Aragon's dignity and devotion, she had borne him only one surviving child, the Princess Mary. As Henry approached middle age, the absence of a male heir gnawed at his sense of destiny. He saw in it not only a personal disappointment, but a looming threat to the stability his father had worked so carefully to secure. To Henry's mind, without a son, the Tudor dynasty might stand on sand. It was in this atmosphere of unease that another figure entered the stage: Anne Boleyn. Unlike Catherine, who had come from one of Europe's great royal houses, Anne was the daughter of an ambitious English courtier. She was clever, confident, and striking, with a presence that drew admiration and unease in equal measure. Unlike other women who had graced Henry's court, Anne refused to be merely a passing favorite. She demanded commitment, and in doing so, she transformed what might have been a fleeting infatuation into a political earthquake. Henry's attraction to Anne became an obsession, and with it, his frustration with Catherine deepened. He convinced himself that his marriage had been cursed from the start, arguing that Catherine had once been his brother's wife, and that Scripture forbade such unions. Though the Pope had granted a dispensation for their marriage, Henry now questioned its validity. If the union was invalid, then Mary was not a legitimate heir, and a new marriage might provide the long-awaited son. This was the beginning of what came to be called the King's Great Matter. At first, Henry turned to the Pope, Clement VII, seeking an annulment. But Europe's politics weighed heavily against him. Catherine was the aunt of the powerful Emperor Charles V, whose armies dominated Italy. The Pope, caught between Henry's demands and the Emperor's influence, hesitated and delayed. Appeals were made, envoys dispatched, arguments crafted in legal and theological terms, but no resolution came. Henry's patience thinned. For a man accustomed to triumph in jousts and courts alike, the Pope's refusal was intolerable. As the stalemate dragged on, Henry began to see more clearly that his authority as king was shackled by obedience to Rome. His frustration fused with his desire for Anne, and together they pushed him toward a decision that would redefine England forever. If the Pope would not grant freedom, then Henry would take it. Gradually, he gathered around him advisors and thinkers sympathetic to reform. Thomas Cranmer, Thomas Cromwell, and others who whispered of a new vision in which the king himself was head of the church within his realm. No longer would foreign authority dictate England's destiny. By making himself supreme in both temporal and spiritual matters, Henry could annul his marriage, wed Anne, and secure the heir he craved. The break was not swift, but inexorable. Acts of Parliament in the early 1530s declared Henry's supremacy, cutting the final cords that bound England to the papacy. In 1533, his marriage to Catherine was annulled by English authority, and Anne Boleyn was crowned queen. The Church of England had been born not as a distant theological ideal, but as the direct result of a king's personal and political struggle. The consequences were profound. Monasteries would soon be dissolved, wealth redirected to the crown, and the English Reformation would take its first irrevocable steps. For Henry, the moment was both triumph and vindication. He had defied the greatest spiritual power in Europe and reshaped his kingdom according to his will. The boy who had once seemed the shining prince of Christendom had become the architect of a national church. And yet, the story was not only one of policy and religion. It was a tale of passion, ambition, and the hunger for legacy. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry had risked all, now stood beside him as queen. Their marriage embodied the daring gamble of a monarch who placed personal desire at the heart of national transformation. Thus, the King's Great Matter was more than a quarrel with the Pope. It was the hinge upon which English history turned. From it emerged a monarch who claimed ultimate authority, a church unbound from Rome, and a kingdom forever altered. What began as a king's longing for a son ended as a revolution in faith and power. The break with Rome did not end with Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. It marked the beginning of a revolution in both religion and politics, a transformation that would reach into every parish, every household, and every corner of English life. Having declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, Henry now moved to consolidate that authority, reshaping the nation's institutions to ensure that his word was law in matters both temporal and spiritual. The result was a kingdom fundamentally altered, where the crown stood higher than pope or priest, and where royal will reach deeper into the daily fabric of society than ever before. One of the most dramatic steps was the dissolution of the monasteries. For centuries, abbeys and convents had been not only spiritual centers, but also vast landowners, repositories of wealth, and symbols of the Catholic Church's enduring influence. Henry, guided by the counsel of Thomas Cromwell, ordered systematic inquiries into these institutions. Reports highlighted corruption and excess, but behind the rhetoric lay a more practical truth. Their riches could greatly enrich the crown. Between 1536 and 1541, the monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized, their treasures carried into the royal coffers. Buildings that had once echoed with chants now stood empty or were repurposed for noble households. The scale of the confiscation was immense, transferring nearly a quarter of England's land from church to crown and its favored supporters. The dissolution was more than an act of financial gain. It was a reordering of power. No longer could abbots and priors act as semi-independent magnates. Their wealth now buttressed royal authority. For Henry, it meant resources to fund his ambitions, and for England, it meant a profound shift in the balance between church and state. Parishioners who had once sought charity at the doors of monasteries now looked to the crown's newly appointed overseers. The fabric of society itself was rewoven, with loyalty redirected away from Rome and toward the monarch. At the same time, Henry tightened his grip on Parliament. Traditionally, the assembly had served as a voice of the realm, balancing crown and nobility. Under Henry, it became an instrument of royal will. Acts of Parliament declared his supremacy, legitimized his marital decisions, and codified the new religious order. The legislative body did not oppose him, it confirmed him. In this way, Parliament's authority grew in theory, but in practice it operated under the firm hand of the king. It was a paradox. By enlisting Parliament to endorse his reforms, Henry elevated its role, yet he also demonstrated that it would bend to his command. Through these measures, Henry VIII emerged as the most powerful monarch England had ever known. His authority extended beyond armies and taxes. It reached into conscience, belief, and the very rituals of daily worship. The Mass was reshaped, the Bible was translated into English, and subjects were required to acknowledge the king's supremacy in matters of faith. Oaths were demanded, dissent was punished, and conformity was enforced. While England did not immediately become Protestant in theology, it was Protestant in structure. The church was national, independent, and answerable to the crown. The impact was immense. Villages that had long looked to Rome now looked to London. Clergy who had once sworn obedience to the Pope now swore it to their king. Political opposition had fewer sanctuaries, for even the pulpit echoed with royal authority. For ordinary men and women, change was felt in the rhythm of worship, in the closing of monasteries, and in the sudden presence of the crown in matters once thought sacred. Cinematically, one can imagine the figure of Henry presiding not only over court and council, but over altar and pulpit as well. His hand stretched across parchment decrees, his seal stamped upon laws that redefined the kingdom's soul. He was no longer simply the successor to a throne. He was the architect of a new order, a monarch who wielded absolute authority in ways unimaginable to his predecessors. This transformation did not pass without resistance, yet Henry's determination ensured that opposition was quelled and his supremacy secured. The England that emerged was not the same realm that had crowned him in 1509. It was a nation where monarchy and religion had fused into one, where the crown was both sword and scepter, and where loyalty to king and loyalty to church became inseparable. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII stood at the pinnacle of power, his kingdom remade in his image. The dissolution of the monasteries had filled his coffers, Parliament had become his tool, and the Church of England bore his mark. What had begun as a quest for a son had grown into a revolution that redefined sovereignty itself. The king's will was now law, his authority absolute, and his England forever changed. Henry VIII's reign, once illuminated by the vigor of youth and the brilliance of reform, grew darker as the years advanced. The king who had dazzled Europe with his strength and intelligence became known as much for his marriages as for his policies. 6 queens would walk into his life, and with them came hopes, betrayals, heartbreak, and tragedy. The story of Henry's family was no less dramatic than his transformation of church and state, and it would leave a legacy that both fascinated and unsettled generations to come. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, had been both loyal and admired, yet the absence of a male heir strained their union beyond repair. Her dignity remained, but she was set aside, living her last years in quiet isolation, while Henry pressed forward with Anne Boleyn. Anne was the great passion, the woman for whom Henry had risked the wrath of Rome and shattered centuries of tradition. But passion cooled into frustration, and political intrigue sealed her fate. The marriage that had promised so much ended abruptly, and with it, the dream of permanence Henry had invested in her. Jane Seymour, gentle and soft-spoken, followed Anne. She gave Henry the son he had long craved, Edward. But the joy was short-lived, for Jane did not live to see him grow. Henry mourned her deeply, remembering her as his true wife, though their time together had been brief. The court, however, moved swiftly. A fourth marriage was arranged, this time to Anne of Cleves, a union designed to secure Protestant alliances abroad. But Henry found no affection in it, claiming disappointment in her appearance and manner. The marriage was annulled almost as quickly as it had been contracted, leaving Anne a comfortable place in England, but no place in Henry's heart. Catherine Howard came next, youthful and lively, but her recklessness brought ruin. In the glittering halls of Henry's later reign, she represented a brief illusion of renewed vitality. Yet whispers of disloyalty surrounded her, and soon her place at Henry's side ended as tragically as Anne Boleyn's had before her. At last came Catherine Parr, intelligent and composed, who not only survived Henry, but also helped reconcile him with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. She offered the aging king a measure of stability in his final years, a steady presence as his health declined, and his once mighty frame grew heavy and worn. Through these 6 marriages, the king's personal life mirrored the turbulence of his reign. He sought love, heirs, and companionship, but more often found disappointment, conflict, and sorrow. Each queen became a chapter in the larger story of a monarch whose desires could alter the course of nations. Their fates were bound not only to Henry's heart, but also to the shifting tides of politics, faith, and power that swirled around the Tudor court. By the 1540s, the once radiant prince had become a figure transformed. He was heavier, his movements slower, his body failing him. Yet, even in decline, his presence commanded awe. One can imagine him seated in his great hall, the flicker of torchlight casting long shadows across his broad frame, the glitter of jewels still upon his robes, but his face lined with age and weariness. Around him lay the memories of queens lost, sons and daughters contested, and a kingdom reshaped by his will. Henry VIII's family life was never merely private. Each marriage carried political consequence. Each wife symbolized alliances or fractures that reverberated through the realm. In the end, it was not only his reforms, his wars, or his grandeur that defined him, but also the drama of his household. The tale of 6 wives became inseparable from the tale of the man himself, a king whose search for stability in love mirrored his relentless quest for stability in power. Thus, the cinematic image of Henry in his twilight is not one of triumphal conquest, but of a monarch aged and heavy, encircled by shadows both personal and political. He had gained much, lost much, and left behind a story both magnificent and tragic. And as England looked upon him in his final years, they saw not only the architect of a new church and a stronger monarchy, but also a man haunted by the costs of his choices, with 6 queens' names etched forever into the story of his reign. Henry VIII left the world in 1547, but the imprint of his reign remained carved into the very structure of England. Few monarchs had ever reshaped their realm so profoundly. When he had first ascended the throne, England was a Catholic kingdom, its loyalties bound to Rome, its monasteries vibrant, and its people accustomed to centuries of ritual and tradition. When he died, that same kingdom was independent of papal authority. Its monasteries dissolved, its wealth redistributed, and its crown elevated above every altar. Henry had not only ruled England, he had remade it. His most enduring legacy was the establishment of a national church, independent from Rome. Though the theology of the Church of England in Henry's time remained cautious, blending old forms with new authority, the break itself was decisive. No future monarch would again be subject to papal commands. The king had made himself supreme, and that supremacy became part of England's identity. For generations, the memory of Henry's defiance would serve as both shield and precedent. A reminder that England was its own master, not a vassal of distant powers. Yet this triumph came with deep fractures. The Reformation in England had not been born from theological consensus, but from the will of a king. As a result, beneath the surface of national unity lay unrest. Some clung fiercely to the old faith, mourning the loss of monasteries and the rhythms of Catholic devotion. Others pressed for more radical reform, eager to sweep away vestiges of the past. Between these forces, tension simmered. Henry's settlement provided stability in his lifetime, but it left to his children a kingdom divided in spirit, pulled between Catholic tradition and Protestant change. Politically, Henry's reign had elevated the monarchy to heights not seen before. Parliament had been used to endorse his reforms, but in doing so, it had also grown in stature. His assertion of royal supremacy, combined with the strengthening of administrative institutions, laid the groundwork for a more centralized and powerful state. The crown no longer shared its authority with powerful abbots or semi-independent nobles. Wealth and land, once scattered across religious institutions, now served the interests of the monarchy and its loyal supporters. This concentration of power gave his heirs both the resources and the structures to rule with unprecedented authority. But authority came with burdens. Henry left behind 3 children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, each born of different mothers, each carrying not only distinct claims, but also distinct religious identities. Edward would inherit a Protestant legacy, Mary would cling to Catholic devotion, and Elizabeth would ultimately attempt to weave a settlement between them. The seeds of future conflict were sown in the soil Henry himself had turned. His children would rule not only with the wealth and power he bequeathed, but also with the divisions he left unresolved. The image of Henry's legacy is therefore one of contrast. On the one hand, he was the monarch who gave England a sense of independence, who infused the crown with unmatched authority, who ensured that the Tudors would not merely survive, but dominate the 16th century. On the other, he left a kingdom wrestling with the meaning of faith, uncertain of its spiritual path, and burdened by the shadows of his personal choices. Cinematically, one can imagine his reign as a vast tapestry. In its center, the figure of Henry, broad and commanding, surrounded by images of broken monasteries, rising palaces, and the Tudor rose blazing above all. At the edges, however, shadows linger, whispers of discontent, the flicker of candles in secret Catholic masses, the debates of reformers calling for more change. His England was both strong and unsettled, glorious and fractured. Henry VIII's legacy is thus not easily measured in victories or defeats. It is measured in transformation. He left behind a new England, one that stood apart from Rome, armed with a monarchy stronger than ever before, yet carrying within it a turbulence that would echo for decades. His children would inherit both his crown and his conflicts, and in the centuries to come, historians would look back on his reign as the moment when England crossed a threshold, stepping into a future that was as uncertain as it was unshakably its own. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the crown passed not to a seasoned prince or a hardened warrior, but to a child of 9 years old. Edward VI, pale and slender, with keen eyes and a studious nature, was suddenly transformed from a boy raised in the cloisters of education into the sovereign of England. The pageantry of his coronation sought to cloak the reality and grandeur, but behind the glittering robes and the solemn oaths lay a simple truth. The kingdom would be ruled not by the boy himself, but by the men who surrounded him. Edward had been carefully schooled in humanist learning and Protestant theology. Tudors praised his sharp intellect, his ability with languages, and his devotion to study, but no amount of learning could prepare him for the burdens of kingship. At 9, he was a symbol, not a ruler. Authority flowed from his crown, yet power rested in the hands of a regency council created by his father's will. In theory, it was a group of peers meant to govern collectively until the king came of age. In practice, it quickly became the stage for rivalry and ambition. At first, leadership fell to Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the boy's uncle. Somerset styled himself Lord Protector, a title that suggested guardianship, but in reality carried near royal authority. Under him, the government pressed forward with the Protestant reforms Henry had begun cautiously. Images were stripped from churches, the English Bible was placed firmly at the center of worship, and the tone of devotion shifted more decisively toward Reformed faith. To reformers, Somerset seemed a champion. To conservatives, he was a dangerous radical. Yet Somerset's power was precarious. His policies abroad, particularly his costly campaigns in Scotland, strained the treasury and frustrated his fellow councillors. At home, economic discontent simmered as enclosures and inflation pressed upon the common people. Rebellions in the countryside flared, and though suppressed, they weakened the protector's standing. The boy king, earnest and intelligent, recorded events in his private journal, but he remained a spectator, not an arbiter. The throne upon which he sat gleamed, but the hand that guided it belonged to others. Into this atmosphere stepped John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland. Shrewder and more pragmatic than Somerset, Dudley maneuvered with care. By 1549, he had displaced the Protector, consolidating power in his own hands. Where Somerset had leaned on the aura of family connection, Dudley built a coalition of support among the council, ruling less as guardian and more as master of state. Under his guidance, reform continued, though with greater calculation. He sought not only to shape religion, but also to secure his own dominance within the machinery of government. For young Edward, these shifts were formative. His education made him sympathetic to the Protestant cause, and his writings reveal a boy already serious beyond his years, convinced that he was chosen to advance God's truth. Yet he remained enclosed, sheltered from the harsher realities of faction and intrigue. Courtiers bowed low before him, but whispered counsel and decisive commands flowed from older men. In this sense, Edward's reign was one of paradox. He was the figurehead of sweeping religious change, yet the architects of that change were the ambitious lords who governed in his name. Cinematically, one can imagine the image of Edward seated upon a high throne, his frame slight beneath the heavy robes of state, the crown almost too large for his youthful brow. Around him loomed the figures of Somerset and Northumberland, casting long shadows, their hands effectively guiding the realm. The boy is king, but the kingdom bends to the will of others. Thus, the opening of Edward VI's reign was marked not by the bold decisions of a sovereign, but by the contest of regents. The Protector Somerset and the Duke of Northumberland each in turn wielded power in the boy's name. Through them, England's transformation quickened, its faith reshaped, and its politics unsettled. Edward, diligent and earnest, absorbed it all, yet remained at a remove, an emblem of hope for reformers, a pawn in the games of statesmen, and a child upon whose frail shoulders the Tudor crown precariously rested. Edward VI's reign, though brief, became a crucible for the Protestant transformation of England. Where Henry VIII had broken with Rome, but left much of Catholic practice intact, Edward's government, driven by his regents and inspired by reformist zeal, pressed further and faster. Under the guiding hand of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and the authority of Somerset, and later Northumberland, the young king's court unleashed changes that touched every parish and altar in the land. At the center of this transformation was the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer in 1549. Crafted in English rather than Latin, it reshaped the experience of worship for clergy and laity alike. Gone were the intricate rites that had bound English devotion to centuries of tradition. In their place came a simpler liturgy, accessible to the ear and tongue of ordinary people. To reformers, it was liberation, worship in a language understood by all. To conservatives, it was a wrenching break, a sudden tearing away of the familiar rhythms of faith. The shift did not stop there. Church interiors, once adorned with painted saints, gilded images, and flickering candles, were stripped bare. Statues were toppled from their niches, rood screens dismantled, and altars replaced by simpler communion tables. The theology of the Mass itself was redefined, with emphasis on the Word and the congregation, rather than the mystery of sacrifice. Parishioners who had grown up in the old faith now entered churches that felt stark, austere, and unsettlingly new. For Edward himself, these reforms aligned with his education and conviction. Though still a boy, he embraced the Protestant cause with earnest devotion, believing that he was chosen by God to advance true religion. In his private journal, he recorded the progress of reforms with satisfaction, his words betraying not the detachment of a child, but the conviction of a young prince who saw himself as a servant of divine providence. To his mind, the cleansing of churches and the new prayer book were not losses, but triumphs, a nation purged of error and rededicated to truth. But the kingdom did not move as one. In 1549, the same year the Book of Common Prayer was imposed, resistance flared into open revolt. In Devon and Cornwall, thousands rose in protest, demanding the restoration of the Latin Mass and the return of traditional practices. Their rebellion was a reminder that the religious heart of England was divided, that centuries of custom could not be erased by statute alone. The uprisings were suppressed, yet the memory lingered. The new faith was not embraced by all, and the crown's authority now extended into the most intimate realm of conscience. Cinematically, one might envision the transformation in a series of haunting images. A parish church, once glowing with painted saints, now emptied of color. Parishioners staring uneasily as craftsmen remove statues. The steady voice of a priest reading the new liturgy in English to a congregation uncertain whether to rejoice or mourn. The old order crumbled not in a single stroke, but in countless small moments. Candles extinguished, murals whitewashed, prayers translated. Northumberland, who replaced Somerset as the power behind the throne, carried the reforms further still. By 1552, a revised Book of Common Prayer eliminated many of the ambiguities that had allowed Catholics to interpret the new rites in traditional ways. The Eucharist was redefined as symbolic, the words of the liturgy sharpened to emphasize Reformed theology. What had begun cautiously under Henry VIII was, under Edward VI, accelerated into a decisive Protestant Reformation. Yet even as these changes advanced, they revealed the fragility of the settlement. Edward was still a child, frail in health, and the permanence of his reforms depended upon his survival. The boy king dreamed of an England firmly anchored in Reformed faith, but his people were divided, and the future of his church was uncertain. Behind the stripped walls of parish churches, one could still hear whispers of Latin prayers, see secret signs of loyalty to Rome, and feel the unease of a nation in transition. Thus, Edward's reign, though short, was momentous. He had presided, through his council, over a transformation that reshaped worship, belief, and identity. Churches were emptied of their images, prayers were spoken in the tongue of the people, and the crown stood as the final authority in religion. Yet beneath the surface, England was unsettled, torn between past and future. The boy king's reforms pointed toward a Protestant destiny, but the question of whether that destiny would endure remained unanswered, poised on the edge of his uncertain life. Edward VI, for all his learning and devotion, was never a robust child. From the earliest years of his reign, observers noted his frailty, his thin frame, his pale complexion, his struggles with recurring illness. Though he carried himself with the seriousness of a young scholar king, the weight of the Tudor crown rested on shoulders too slight to bear it for long. By the time he reached his mid-teens, the promise of a long reign, one that might secure Protestant reform for generations, was already slipping away. In 1553, Edward's health declined rapidly. Courtiers and physicians whispered of his weakness, though official proclamations sought to reassure the realm. The boy who had once recorded national affairs with sharp precision in his diary now weakened day by day, his body failing even as his mind remained alert. For the reformers who had invested their hopes in him, the prospect of his death was more than personal tragedy. It was a looming crisis for the future of England's religion and crown. The question of succession became urgent. By law and by his father's will, the crown was to pass to Edward's half-sisters, Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. Yet both posed challenges. Mary was a devout Catholic, determined to restore the old faith. Elizabeth, though Protestant in sympathy, was still young and politically untested. To Edward and his advisors, particularly the ambitious Duke of Northumberland, allowing Mary to inherit meant undoing all the reforms that had defined his reign. It was in this atmosphere that Edward drafted what came to be known as his device for the succession. Guided by both conviction and counsel, he set aside his sisters and named Lady Jane Grey as heir. Jane, the teenage granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary, was devoutly Protestant, well-educated, and married into Northumberland's family. For Edward, she seemed the safeguard of the Reformed faith, a way to ensure that his short reign would not be erased by the triumph of Catholic restoration. The decision was momentous. It broke with tradition, disregarded parliamentary statute, and set aside bloodline in favor of religious conviction. Edward, though only 15, approached it with the earnestness that had marked his entire life. In his mind, he was not usurping the natural order, but preserving God's true church in England. To him, the salvation of the kingdom outweighed the claims of Mary or Elizabeth. By the summer of 1553, Edward's decline was unmistakable. The court braced itself for the inevitable. One can picture the scene: the young king lying in his chamber, sunlight dimmed by heavy drapes, counselors gathered in hushed tones, the air heavy with the knowledge that the Tudor experiment in Protestantism hung by a thread. Outside the palace, Londoners murmured with uncertainty, for all knew that the king's days were numbered. On July 6, 1553, Edward VI died at the age of 15. His passing left not only grief, but a dangerous void. He had been the boy king who dreamed of a reformed England, yet he departed before those dreams could be secured. His device pointed the way to Lady Jane Grey, but the realm itself was uncertain, divided in loyalty, and haunted by the specter of civil discord. Edward's death marked the end of innocence in the Tudor story. His reign had been short, earnest, and transformative, but his departure without an undisputed heir opened the gates to crisis. The boy who had studied theology, written with precision, and believed himself a servant of divine providence, left behind a kingdom trembling between futures, one led by Mary, the Catholic heir by law, and one by Jane, the Protestant heir by Edward's will. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic succession struggles in English history, born from the fragile body of a king who had carried so heavy a burden for so brief a time. When Edward VI died in July 1553, England was left in a state of deep uncertainty. By the terms of his will, Lady Jane Grey, a girl of barely 16, was declared queen. She had been carefully educated, devout in her Protestant faith, and known for her piety and learning. Yet she had never aspired to rule, and the crown was placed upon her head not because of her ambition, but because Edward and his counselors feared what might come if Mary, his elder half-sister and a staunch Catholic, were to inherit. For the Duke of Northumberland and his allies, Jane was the hope of preserving the Protestant cause and protecting their own positions of influence. On July 10th, Jane was brought to the Tower of London and formally proclaimed queen. The ceremonies followed the pattern of tradition with heralds and proclamations, but beneath the official words there was little sense of confidence. The people of England had not been prepared for this sudden departure from the natural line of succession. Many still regarded Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, as the rightful heir according to Henry VIII's settlement. Legitimacy weighed heavily in the minds of nobles and commoners alike, and Jane's claim seemed fragile despite the backing of Edward's will. Mary, then 40 years old, acted decisively. While Jane remained in the Tower, Mary gathered her supporters in East Anglia. Local gentry, men of influence, and ordinary villagers responded to her call. Her cause combined the authority of law, for she was Henry's daughter, with the promise of restoring the Catholic faith. Within days, her supporters had grown into an army, while Jane's position depended entirely on the loyalty of a council already uncertain of its own course. The struggle was brief. Northumberland set out to confront Mary, but his forces were unsteady, and his political support crumbled. In London, the council that had declared Jane queen began to waver as messages arrived of Mary's growing strength. By July 19th, less than 2 weeks after Jane had been proclaimed, the decision was made. The council shifted allegiance, and the people of London welcomed Mary as their queen. Jane's reign, if it could be called that, had lasted only 9 days. She became known thereafter as the 9 Days Queen, remembered less as a sovereign than as a victim of circumstance. A young woman used by powerful men and caught in the tide of religious and dynastic conflict. She was returned to confinement in the Tower, her crown removed almost as soon as it had been placed upon her. Mary, by contrast, entered London with triumph. Crowds greeted her with joy, bells rang, and the kingdom recognized her as the rightful daughter of Henry VIII. Her claim had prevailed not only because she had gathered an army, but because she represented the lawful order of succession. Many who had no great loyalty to the Catholic faith nevertheless supported her as the legitimate heir, unwilling to see the throne manipulated by faction and ambition. Thus, in July 1553, the rule of Lady Jane Grey ended almost as quickly as it began, and Mary Tudor ascended the throne. Her victory was not only personal, but symbolic. The restoration of Henry VIII's will, the defeat of those who sought to alter succession for religious ends, and the triumph of legitimacy over intrigue. Yet her accession also meant the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. for Mary carried with her the determination to reverse the Protestant reforms of her brother's reign and to bring England once more under the authority of Rome. The kingdom had chosen her, but in doing so, it had also chosen a path that would soon lead into conflict, fervor, and controversy. Mary's accession to the throne in 1553 marked not only the triumph of legitimacy over intrigue, but also the beginning of a determined campaign to reverse the Protestant reforms of her brother's reign. For Mary, Catholicism was not simply a personal devotion, it was the core of her identity, the faith of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and the foundation of what she believed England must return to if it were to be saved. From the first days of her rule, she sought to heal what she saw as the rupture caused by Henry's break with Rome and Edward's Protestant innovations. To secure her cause, Mary turned to alliance. In 1554, she married Philip of Spain, son of Charles V, and heir to the most powerful Catholic monarchy in Europe. The marriage was a political match, designed to bind England to Spain and reinforce its Catholic orientation. For Mary, it offered both legitimacy and strength, ensuring that her restoration of the old faith would have continental support. Yet the union was controversial in England. Many feared foreign influence, resented the idea of a Spanish king consort, and worried that England might become a pawn in Habsburg ambitions. Still, Mary pressed forward, convinced that her mission required such a partnership. Religious policy followed swiftly. England was formally reconciled with Rome in 1554, with papal authority restored. Monasteries were not re-established in full, but the spiritual allegiance of the kingdom was once again tied to the papacy. For devout Catholics, this was a moment of triumph, the return of England to the universal church. For Protestants, it was a profound reversal, one that forced them to choose between conscience and obedience. Mary's government pursued conformity with determination. Laws against heresy were revived, and those who refused to abandon Protestant teaching were prosecuted. Among them were bishops, ministers, and ordinary believers who clung to the Book of Common Prayer or the theology of reform. Between 1555 and 1558, nearly 300 Protestants were executed, including prominent figures such as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. These burnings, carried out in public squares and witnessed by crowds, were intended as warnings. Instead, they created martyrs whose stories spread in whispers and later in print, especially through works like Fox's Book of Martyrs, which immortalized their endurance. It was in these years that Mary earned the epithet that history would remember her by, Bloody Mary. To her supporters, she was a queen of piety, restoring England to the true path. To her opponents, she became a symbol of persecution, her name forever linked with fire and punishment. The sobriquet, though shaped as much by Protestant propaganda as by fact, clung to her legacy. It overshadowed her devotion, her sense of duty, and her efforts to secure England's place in Catholic Europe. Beyond religion, Mary's reign was also marked by tension. Her marriage to Philip proved unpopular and personally disappointing. Philip spent little time in England, and the union produced no children. Hopes of an heir who might secure a Catholic dynasty faded with each passing year. Without a son or daughter to succeed her, Mary's restoration of Catholicism rested upon her own fragile health and uncertain longevity. By the end of her reign, Mary had achieved part of what she set out to do. England was formally reconciled with Rome, and Protestant leaders had been silenced. Yet her methods left deep scars. Instead of uniting the realm under one faith, she deepened the divisions. The executions created a memory of suffering that hardened Protestant identity, ensuring that once her Catholic settlement collapsed, the return to reform would be even more determined. Mary Tudor had ascended the throne with triumph, determined to restore the faith of her mother and the traditions of her childhood. She had allied with the greatest Catholic power in Europe, restored papal authority, and punished dissent with unflinching severity. But in the process, she gave her enemies a weapon more enduring than her policies, a name that turned her piety into infamy. In the end, Bloody Mary became her legacy, a reminder of how a queen's devotion could, in the eyes of history, be overshadowed by the flames of persecution. Mary I's reign, which had begun with such determination, ended in sorrow and disillusionment. Her dream had been to restore England to the Catholic faith, secure the succession with a Catholic heir, and anchor her kingdom firmly within the great Catholic alliance of Europe. Yet as the years passed, her hopes slipped further from her grasp. By the time of her death in 1558, the queen who had once been greeted with such joy entered her grave, weary, isolated, and burdened with a sense of failure. Central to Mary's despair was the absence of children. Twice she believed herself pregnant, her court preparing eagerly for the arrival of an heir who would secure the Catholic settlement for the future. Both times her hopes proved false. The first phantom pregnancy in 1555 was followed by another 2 years later. Each disappointment was not only a personal heartbreak, but a political disaster. Without an heir, Mary's Catholic revival rested only on her own fragile life. The knowledge that Elizabeth, her Protestant half-sister, stood next in line cast a long shadow over every decision. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, intended as the cornerstone of her restoration, also became a source of frustration. Philip spent little time in England, and when he was present, he inspired suspicion and resentment among the English people. Many feared that the country was being drawn into Spain's wars and ambitions. Their fears were not unfounded. In 1557, England entered war alongside Spain against France, a conflict that strained resources and brought little glory. In January 1558, Calais, the last English possession on the continent, fell to the French. Its loss was devastating, not only as a military defeat, but as a blow to national pride. England's link to its medieval past in France was severed, and Mary reportedly declared that when she died, the name Calais would be found engraved upon her heart. The Queen's religious policies, once driven by zeal, now brought her increasing isolation. The burnings of Protestants, intended to enforce conformity, had left a bitter legacy. Instead of reconciling her people to Catholicism, they hardened resistance and created martyrs whose stories spread even in secret. Ordinary men and women began to view the Queen with fear rather than reverence. The title Bloody Mary, born of this persecution, stuck to her, eroding her reputation in ways she could not overcome. What she saw as devotion to truth, many saw as cruelty. By her final years, Mary's health was failing. The weight of disappointment, the absence of an heir, the unpopularity of her Spanish marriage, and the sting of military defeat pressed heavily upon her spirit. Once welcomed into London as the rightful heir of Henry VIII, she now found herself estranged from her subjects. The people who had cheered her ascension now looked anxiously toward Elizabeth, hoping for a new beginning. On November 17, 1558, Mary I died at the age of 42. She passed quietly, with Philip absent abroad and her people distant in their loyalty. Her reign had lasted barely 5 years, yet it left an indelible mark. She had restored papal authority, reasserted Catholic practice, and ruled with conviction, but she had also alienated her subjects, lost England's last foothold in France, and failed to secure the succession she so desperately desired. Mary's story is one of both devotion and tragedy. She had sought to be the queen who healed the breach with Rome and restored the faith of her mother. Instead, history remembered her as a figure of persecution and failure. In her lifetime, she was overshadowed by disappointment. In death, her legacy was shaped by the triumph of her successor. For as Mary was laid to rest, Elizabeth Tudor ascended the throne, and with her began a new chapter that would redefine England's place in the world. Elizabeth Tudor was 25 years old when she inherited the crown of England in November 1558. The death of her half-sister Mary closed one chapter of turbulence and opened another. For Elizabeth, the path to the throne had been long shadowed by suspicion. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose marriage to Henry VIII had once divided the kingdom, her legitimacy had been questioned since birth. Now, as she placed the crown upon her head, she carried not only the weight of royal tradition, but also the burden of a fractured realm and the watchful gaze of a skeptical Europe. England itself was deeply unsettled. The years of Henry's break with Rome, Edward's Protestant zeal, and Mary's Catholic restoration had left the kingdom torn in two. A nation that had once prayed together now stood divided between altars stripped bare and altars redressed with candles and crucifixes. Elizabeth inherited not a stable order, but a battlefield of belief. where every prayer could be seen as a statement of allegiance. Abroad, foreign courts observed her rise with doubt. Catholic monarchs in Spain and France viewed her as illegitimate and her rule as precarious. Many expected her reign to falter, perhaps even collapse in the face of internal unrest. At home, whispers of conspiracy grew, for those loyal to Rome still considered Mary, Queen of Scots, the rightful heir. Assassination plots were not mere fantasies, but very real dangers in the minds of Elizabeth's counselors. From the first day of her reign, the young queen lived with the knowledge that her throne was not secure. Yet Elizabeth possessed a resilience and clarity that belied her years. She had survived the treacherous court of her father, the suspicion of her brother's reign, and the hostility of her sisters. These experiences had shaped her into a cautious but determined ruler. She understood the value of patience, the necessity of compromise, and the power of appearances. Standing before her council, she declared that she had no desire to probe into the private consciences of her subjects. Her concern was for loyalty to the crown, not endless persecution over belief. Her coronation in January 1559 sought to project both authority and hope. Crowds lined the streets of London, cheering with a mixture of relief and curiosity. After years of religious upheaval and unpopular rule, many looked to Elizabeth as a fresh beginning. She in turn presented herself as approachable yet regal, a monarch who could bridge the gap between the grandeur of her office and the anxieties of her people. Still, the challenges were immense. She inherited a kingdom burdened by debt, threatened by foreign powers, and divided in faith. Every decision she made would be scrutinized both at home and abroad. A single misstep could reignite rebellion, invite invasion, or fracture her government. Yet in those first months, Elizabeth displayed the steady confidence that would come to define her reign. She surrounded herself with able advisors, including William Cecil, whose loyalty and pragmatism became indispensable. Together, they began the careful work of balancing reform with stability. Elizabeth's early days as queen were therefore marked not by triumph, but by careful calculation. She knew that she could not afford rashness. Her authority rested on her ability to convince both England and Europe that her rule was legitimate, capable, and enduring. To many, she was still the daughter of a controversial marriage, a woman in a world of male rulers, and a Protestant in a divided land. But Elizabeth also recognized that her very survival had been proof of her resilience. Thus, the new reign began with uncertainty, but also with promise. The young queen faced a kingdom weary of turmoil, hostile powers beyond its shores, and dangers lurking within. Yet in her composure, her intelligence, and her quiet determination, there was the beginning of a new story. Elizabeth Tudor, the last of the Tudors, stepped onto the stage not as a figure of frailty, but as a sovereign prepared to meet suspicion with strength and doubt with resolve. Elizabeth I understood from the moment she ascended the throne that the question of religion would define her reign. Her father had broken from Rome, her brother had carried reform to new heights, and her sister had sought to undo it all in a fiery Catholic restoration. The result was a kingdom exhausted by upheaval, suspicious of rulers who sought to dictate conscience, and fractured along lines of faith. If Elizabeth hoped to endure, she needed a settlement that could unify her people without reopening the wounds of the past. In 1559, the Queen and her council crafted what became known as the Elizabethan settlement. It was less a rigid blueprint than a careful compromise, designed to satisfy enough of both Catholics and Protestants to restore stability. Through two key acts of Parliament, the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity, the foundations of a new religious order were laid. Elizabeth was declared Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a title chosen with deliberate moderation, avoiding the more absolute supreme head that her father had claimed. Services would follow the Book of Common Prayer, but the text itself was carefully revised to allow for multiple interpretations, leaving room for those who leaned toward Catholic traditions as well as for those firmly in the Protestant camp. The genius of the settlement lay in its ambiguity. Altars became communion tables, but crosses could remain. Vestments for clergy were retained, yet simplified. The Mass was replaced, but the liturgy preserved language that could be read as either symbol or sacrament. In parish after parish, the outward forms of worship seemed familiar enough to comfort the conservative, yet reformed enough to reassure the Protestant. Elizabeth's aim was not theological purity, but political peace, and she was willing to allow a degree of flexibility if it meant avoiding the endless cycle of rebellion and repression that had plagued her predecessors. This policy reflected Elizabeth's own instinctive moderation. Personally Protestant in conviction, she nevertheless distrusted zeal and extremes. To her, faith was as much about order and loyalty as it was about doctrine. "I would not open windows into men's souls," she was reported to have said, signaling her reluctance to police the inner conscience of her subjects. What mattered to her was uniformity in practice, not uniformity in private belief. Abroad, the settlement was met with skepticism and hostility. Rome rejected it outright, and Catholic monarchs on the continent viewed Elizabeth as a heretic. Yet within England, it gradually took root. The majority of the population, weary of turmoil, accepted the compromise. Extremes remained on both sides: committed Catholics who still looked to Mary, Queen of Scots, as the rightful heir, and fervent Protestants who demanded further reform. But Elizabeth's middle path gave the kingdom breathing space. Visually, one could imagine an English parish church in the early years of her reign, a simple communion table set before the congregation, a cross still visible above it, and the English Bible resting open for all to hear. These were the symbols of the settlement, blending past and present, tradition and reform. They embodied the balance Elizabeth sought, a church that was national and unified, without surrendering either to Rome or to radical zeal. Over time, the Elizabethan settlement became more than a temporary compromise. It became the enduring foundation of the Church of England. By insisting on outward conformity while allowing inward diversity, Elizabeth created a structure that withstood pressures from both sides. Her policy was not without conflict, but it provided the stability her realm desperately needed. It allowed her to redirect energy toward defending the kingdom, managing foreign threats, and cultivating the image of a monarch whose authority was secure. In the years that followed, Elizabeth's religious policy would be tested by plots, papal excommunication, and the rising tide of conflict with Spain. Yet the settlement she established in those first crucial months of her reign endured. It was, at its heart, an act of statecraft, an answer not to the demands of theologians, but to the needs of a fractured nation. Through it, Elizabeth gave her people a measure of peace and gave herself the foundation upon which to build one of the most remarkable reigns in English history. Elizabeth's reign, though rooted in compromise at home, quickly found itself entangled in dangers that could not be contained by moderation alone. Her Elizabethan settlement had offered England a fragile peace in matters of faith, but enemies both within and without saw her throne as vulnerable. For decades, the specter of conspiracy and foreign invasion haunted her rule, culminating in one of the most dramatic confrontations in English history. The first great challenge came from within. In 1569, the Rising of the North erupted, a rebellion led by powerful Catholic nobles in the north of England. Their aim was clear: to depose Elizabeth, restore Catholic worship, and place Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. Mary, Elizabeth's cousin and the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, represented to many Catholics the legitimate heir, untainted by the disputed marriage of Anne Boleyn. Exiled from her own kingdom of Scotland and held under Elizabeth's watch, Mary became a living rallying point for discontent. Though the rebellion was suppressed, it revealed the depth of opposition Elizabeth faced, especially in regions where loyalty to Rome remained strong. Mary Stuart's presence in England proved to be one of the most persistent threats of the entire reign. From the moment she fled Scotland in 1568 and sought Elizabeth's protection, she became both guest and prisoner. To Elizabeth, keeping her alive was both a shield and a danger. Mary's claim gave Catholic powers abroad, Spain, France, and the papacy, a figure to champion. Plots multiplied: the Ridolfi plot in 1571, the Throckmorton plot in 1583, and most famously the Babington plot in 1586, each designed to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. For nearly 20 years, Elizabeth hesitated. She resisted the calls of her counselors to remove her cousin, clinging to the hope that mercy could coexist with security. Yet the Babington plot proved decisive. When evidence surfaced that Mary herself had approved of the scheme to murder Elizabeth, the Queen's patience ended. Reluctantly and with deep personal conflict, she signed Mary's death warrant. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. With her death, Elizabeth removed the most dangerous figurehead for Catholic rebellion, but also set a precedent that weighed heavily on her conscience. A queen had executed a queen. Even as domestic threats were quelled, foreign powers loomed larger. Chief among them was Spain, the mightiest empire of the age. Philip II, once Mary Tudor's husband and long the champion of Catholic Europe, regarded Elizabeth as both a heretic and an enemy. England's growing support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, combined with its privateers harassing Spanish treasure fleets, pushed the two kingdoms toward inevitable war. The execution of Mary Stuart in 1587 removed any final restraint. To Philip, Elizabeth had overstepped not only the bounds of religion, but of monarchy itself. The confrontation reached its climax in 1588 with the Spanish Armada. A vast fleet, more than 100 ships strong, sailed from Spain with the aim of overthrowing Elizabeth and restoring Catholic rule. England braced for invasion. The outcome was uncertain. Spain commanded immense resources and had the prestige of empire on its side. Elizabeth, however, stood firm. She rallied her people with words that became legendary, declaring her readiness to live and die among them for the kingdom she ruled. The Armada's fate was sealed not only by English resistance, but by the sea itself. English ships, lighter and more maneuverable, harried the Spanish fleet, preventing it from joining forces with troops waiting in the Low Countries. Then storms scattered the Armada as it attempted to retreat, wrecking many of its ships along the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. What had been proclaimed as an unstoppable Catholic crusade ended in disaster. For England, the defeat of the Spanish Armada was more than a military triumph. It was a moment of national awakening. The kingdom that had once seemed fragile, divided, and vulnerable now stood proud, united in the memory of its deliverance. Elizabeth's rule, once shadowed by suspicion, was now bathed in the glow of victory. The queen who had faced rebellion, conspiracy, and invasion emerged as the symbol of resilience. Yet beneath the triumph, Elizabeth knew the threats had not vanished. Catholic Europe remained hostile, and divisions at home endured. But in 1588, England had survived the greatest challenge of her reign, and the image of Elizabeth as the steadfast sovereign was secured for generations. Her words, her resolve, and the Armada's defeat became the defining climax of her story, the moment when a kingdom found its voice and its queen found her place in history. By the closing decades of the 16th century, Elizabeth's reign had come to be seen not merely as a time of survival, but as an age of extraordinary flourishing. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had given the kingdom confidence, and that confidence radiated outward into exploration, trade, and culture. The England that Elizabeth inherited as a realm, divided and anxious, was now reimagining itself as a rising power, eager to assert its presence on the global stage and to cultivate a rich cultural identity at home. One of the most visible signs of this transformation was the expansion of exploration and commerce. Seafarers such as Sir Francis Drake circled the globe, bringing back not only treasure, but also the prestige of daring achievement. Drake's voyage around the world between 1577 and 1580 captured the imagination of the nation, presenting England as capable of feats once reserved for Iberian empires. Sir Walter Raleigh, too, became a figure of renown, championing ventures across the Atlantic, including the ill-fated Roanoke colony, which nonetheless symbolized the bold beginnings of English ambitions in the New World. Though often perilous, these journeys established England as a player in the contests of empire, and they laid foundations for trade networks that would, in time, transform the nation's economy. Alongside exploration, commerce expanded. The chartering of trading companies such as the Muscovy Company and the East India Company pointed toward a future of global enterprise. English merchants began to look beyond Europe for opportunities, engaging with distant markets in Asia and the Americas. Even if the fruits of empire were still in their infancy, the spirit of adventure and enterprise infused the Elizabethan court with a sense of boundless possibility. Yet it was not only across oceans that Elizabethan England thrived. At home, the cultural flowering was remarkable. The theaters of London filled with audiences hungry for stories, and at their center stood William Shakespeare. His plays, alongside those of contemporaries like Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson, gave voice to the anxieties, aspirations, and imagination of the age. From the histories that reflected upon England's turbulent past to the comedies and tragedies that explored love, ambition, and fate, the Elizabethan stage became the mirror of a nation discovering itself anew. Beyond the theater, the arts flourished in music, poetry, and visual expression. The madrigal captured the harmony of voices, while poets such as Edmund Spenser offered epic visions in works like The Faerie Queene, celebrating both myth and monarchy. Scientific inquiry, too, gained momentum, with figures like John Dee blending mathematics, astronomy, and navigation in pursuit of knowledge that straddled both science and mysticism. The intellectual energy of the era reflected a kingdom no longer looking inward in fear, but outward in curiosity and ambition. At the heart of this cultural and political transformation stood Elizabeth herself. She cultivated an image that became legendary, the Virgin Queen, untouched by marriage, devoted wholly to her people and her realm. Whether this image reflected reality mattered less than the way it resonated. Portraits presented her as ageless, adorned with symbols of power and purity, embodying both majesty and myth. Court poets and playwrights wove her into allegories, portraying her as Astrea, the goddess of justice, or Gloriana, the radiant monarch of Spenser's epic. Through this symbolism, Elizabeth was no longer merely a queen. She was the embodiment of England's destiny. The Virgin Queen became more than a political posture. It was a unifying myth. In a kingdom long torn between faiths and factions, Elizabeth herself became the stable figure at its center. Her personal image binding together the narratives of triumph at sea, expansion abroad, and flourishing culture at home. The idea of Elizabeth as eternal, incorruptible, and sovereign helped consolidate loyalty and inspire generations. This age, which later historians would call the Elizabethan Golden Age, was not without its shadows. Poverty remained widespread, and international rivals loomed. Yet it was an era when England believed in its future with new intensity. The energy of exploration, the wealth of artistic creation, and the enduring myth of the Virgin Queen combined to produce a moment in which a once fractured nation came to see itself as a rising power, destined for greatness. By the time Elizabeth approached the twilight of her reign, the transformation was undeniable. The young queen, who had once inherited a kingdom fraught with suspicion and division, had presided over decades of stability and growth. Her image had transcended politics, becoming a legend in her own time. The Elizabethan Golden Age was both reality and myth, but together they gave England a foundation of identity and ambition that would endure long after the Virgin Queen's crown was laid to rest. Elizabeth's final years were marked by the paradox that often surrounds long reigns. The queen, who had brought stability and glory to her realm, also came to embody the burdens of age, loss, and the passing of an era. By the turn of the 17th century, Elizabeth had ruled for more than 4 decades. She was no longer the radiant Virgin Queen of her early portraits, but a figure weighed down by years of responsibility and surrounded by reminders of mortality. The court that had once thrived with music, poetry, and theater now often murmured with uncertainty. Many of Elizabeth's closest companions had passed away. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, her lifelong favorite, had died in 1588. Sir Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, was gone by 1590. Even William Cecil, Lord Burghley, who had served her faithfully since her accession, died in 1598. One by one, the great figures of her reign disappeared, leaving the queen increasingly isolated. Though she still retained her wit and sharpness, the energy of her youth had faded, and her council was now filled with younger men who belonged to a generation she struggled to understand. The question of succession also weighed heavily. Elizabeth had never married, never produced an heir, and as the years advanced, anxiety grew over what would follow her death. She steadfastly refused to name a successor, perhaps fearing that to do so would weaken her own authority. Yet it was clear to many that James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, was the most likely candidate. Ironically, the child of the woman Elizabeth had executed would inherit her throne. Despite these private concerns, Elizabeth remained outwardly resolute. She continued to cultivate her image as the Virgin Queen, eternal and undiminished. Portraits from her later years, though increasingly stylized, reinforced the myth of her ageless authority. In public appearances, she still inspired devotion, though the murmurs of fatigue and discontent grew louder. England had suffered economic strain from long wars with Spain and conflict in Ireland. Rebellions in Ireland demanded costly campaigns, and victories were hard won. The triumph of the Armada seemed long past, and the burdens of empire were beginning to press. Personally, Elizabeth sank into melancholy. The death of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, in 1601 after his failed rebellion cut deeply. Once a favorite and perhaps the last great figure of her personal circle, Essex's execution was both a political necessity and a personal wound. The Queen, who had long balanced politics with personal affections, now found herself more alone than ever. Her final years were marked by an aura of solemnity. She reportedly grew reluctant to sleep, fearful of what dreams might bring. Courtiers described her as restless, walking the halls, leaning against cushions rather than lying in bed. To those who had once seen her as Gloriana, the goddess-like figure of Spenser's poetry, the sight of a weary, aged queen was both poignant and unsettling. Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, at the age of 69. With her passing, the Tudor dynasty came to an end. Her death was mourned across the realm, for despite the struggles of her final years, her reign had given England decades of relative stability, cultural flowering, and a new sense of national identity. The crown passed peacefully to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Her legacy, however, far outshone the sorrows of her last days. Elizabeth had ruled as a woman in a world of men, navigating enemies at home and abroad, balancing faith and politics, and transforming herself into a symbol larger than life. The Elizabethan Golden Age was as much her creation as it was her nation's, a partnership between monarch and people that gave England confidence in its future. In the centuries that followed, Elizabeth I would be remembered as one of England's greatest rulers. Her reign became synonymous with exploration, culture, and resilience. Though she died weary and alone, history remembers her not in decline but in triumph, as the Virgin Queen who gave her people stability, inspired their imagination, and secured her place among the legends of England. The death of Elizabeth in March 1603 marked more than the passing of a monarch. It signaled the end of an entire dynasty. The Tudors had risen from obscurity on a misty battlefield at Bosworth more than a century earlier, and now their line came to its close in the person of a queen who had ruled for 45 years. What began with Henry Tudor's unlikely victory over Richard III ended with Elizabeth I's solitary death at Richmond Palace, and in between stretched one of the most transformative centuries in English history. The Tudor story is, at its heart, the story of how England remade itself. When Henry VII claimed the throne, England was weary of civil war, uncertain of its future, and vulnerable to foreign meddling. His reign brought peace through careful policy, frugality, and the slow but steady consolidation of power. He left behind a monarchy stronger than any in generations, and though his methods were often cautious and exacting, his work laid the foundations of security. His legacy was that of the architect, quiet, deliberate, but enduring. His son, Henry VIII, shattered that stability in ways no one could have foreseen. Larger than life, ambitious, and determined to secure his dynasty, he tore England away from Rome in pursuit of a male heir and personal sovereignty. The break with the papacy reshaped the kingdom forever, transforming monarchy, church, and society alike. Henry's reign was filled with grandeur and contradiction. He was both builder and destroyer, visionary and tyrant. Yet in his actions he created a new England, one no longer beholden to papal authority and increasingly centered on the crown itself. The cost was high, but the direction was irreversible. Edward VI carried forward the Protestant vision with youthful zeal, but his early death left his reforms incomplete. Mary I reversed course, passionately seeking to restore Catholicism, but her reign ended in failure and sorrow. In her fervor, she revealed how deeply the kingdom had changed, how impossible it was to turn back the tide entirely. Her attempts to reconcile England with Rome only hardened divisions and, despite her devotion, left her remembered with bitterness. It was Elizabeth, the last Tudor, who gathered together the fragments of her predecessor's efforts and wove them into a new national fabric. By choosing a path of moderation in religion, she steadied her realm. By surviving plots and defeating the Armada, she gave England security and pride. By encouraging exploration and allowing culture to flourish, she created an age that future generations would recall as golden. Her reign turned the uncertainty of the 16th century into a story of resilience and aspiration. The Tudors thus represent a dynasty of transformation. They did not inherit a secure realm, they built it. From the chaos of civil war, they fashioned monarchy into an institution more centralized and commanding than it had been in centuries. From the conflict of religion, they forged a church tied to the nation rather than to Rome. From the ambitions of individuals, they inspired a culture that looked outward, to the seas, to the stage, to the future. Yet the dynasty was also one of contradictions. Henry VII's caution contrasted with Henry VIII's extravagance. Edward's reformist zeal clashed with Mary's restoration. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, ended the line by choosing not to marry or bear children. Each ruler left unfinished business, and yet each contributed something essential to the shape of England. Together, they made a century of turbulence into a century of definition. When Elizabeth died, the crown passed peacefully to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. The Stuart dynasty would inherit both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Tudor legacy. They would find a crown powerful, but a kingdom restless, a church national but divided, a people proud but contentious. The Tudors had not solved every problem, they had created new ones, but they had also given England something priceless: continuity, identity, and a sense of destiny. Looking back, the image of the Tudors is one of drama and myth as much as reality. The battle banners of Bosworth, the imposing figure of Henry VIII, the tragedies of his wives, the flames of Marian persecution, the majesty of Elizabeth's coronation, the storm-tossed wreckage of the Armada. These images endure because they capture the essence of a dynasty that embodied both the fears and the hopes of its people. The Tudors did not simply rule, they became legends. Their century was one of profound change. Economically, England moved toward greater trade and the beginnings of overseas expansion. Politically, the crown became the center of national life. Religiously, the break with Rome and the creation of a distinct English church altered the course of faith not only for England, but for the wider world. Culturally, the flowering of poetry, drama, and music created treasures that endure to this day. The Tudor age was both a crucible and a catalyst, forging a nation that would in time grow into a global power. Elizabeth's death closed the Tudor chapter, but it did not end the story. The Stuarts would face civil war, regicide, and revolution. The balance of monarchy and parliament would be tested in ways even the Tudors could not have imagined. Yet the groundwork of that struggle, the conviction that England was a realm unto itself, guided by its own monarch and its own church, was laid in Tudor times. Without the Tudors, there could have been no later England as we know it. The rise of the Tudors from Bosworth Field to Elizabeth's death is thus the story of emergence, of a dynasty that climbed from obscurity to shape the destiny of a nation. It is a story of ambition, conflict, triumph, and failure. It is also a story of survival. How through wars, betrayals, and rivalries, a family held the crown for over a century, and in doing so, transformed the realm they ruled. As Elizabeth's coffin was carried to Westminster Abbey, mourners wept not only for the Queen, but for an age. They knew they were witnessing the end of something unique, a dynasty that had risen from the turmoil of civil war to preside over peace, reformation, and Renaissance. The Tudor name, once uncertain, now belonged to history, and its resonance would echo for centuries. The Tudors did not simply govern England, they gave it a new identity. And though their line ended with Elizabeth, their legacy endured in the institutions, the culture, and the very imagination of the English people. To speak of England's passage into the modern world is to speak of the Tudors, for they carried a fractured kingdom through turbulence into a new sense of nationhood. From Bosworth to the Golden Age, the Tudor century was a saga of destiny fulfilled, a bridge between medieval and modern, and a testament to the enduring power of leadership, vision, and myth. And though the dynasty itself passed, its story remains one of the defining chapters in the long history of England.